The dawn broke gray and cold over the Yorkshire moorlands on November 15, 1944. Captain James Whitmore stood alone in the observation post, his fingers trembling as he held the radio receiver. The static crackled like distant gunfire, a sound he had learned to hate more than any enemy artillery. His jaw clenched. His eyes, once bright with purpose, had grown hollow. In his other hand, he clutched a letter, its edges worn from being read 1,000 times. Outside, the wind howled across the barren landscape. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of tanks echoed through the valley. The war hero who had promised victory, who had stood before 500 soldiers just weeks ago with confidence burning in his chest, now stood paralyzed. His hand shook so violently he had to set the radio down. "Captain?" A young voice called from behind him. Lieutenant Davies, barely 23 years old, approached cautiously. His uniform was crisp, untouched by real combat. "Not yet." "The men are ready for orders, sir." "They're waiting for you." James didn't turn around. He couldn't bear to see the hope in that boy's eyes. He knew what awaited them. He knew because he had seen it before, 3 times before. He had seen the light fade from young eyes like those. He had heard the silence that follows screaming, and he had promised it would not happen again. "Tell them to wait," James finally whispered. The letter in his hand was dated October 10th. It was from his wife, Margaret. She had written about their daughter Elizabeth's birthday. She would be turning 12. Margaret had written about the garden they would plant together when he came home. She had written about the life they would build when this darkness finally ended. Every word was underlined with desperate hope, the kind of hope that breaks a man far more than any bullet could. James had written back. He had promised he would make it home for Christmas. He had promised Elizabeth a bicycle. He had promised victory. He had promised that the men under his command would come back. He had promised that the war would end in their favor, that all this sacrifice would mean something. But promises made in wartime are fragile things. They shatter like glass under artillery fire. 3 months earlier, in August of 1944, James had walked into a briefing room filled with senior officers. The strategic maps showed the Germans retreating. The intelligence suggested a final push could break their defenses entirely. Command wanted volunteers, officers willing to lead an offensive operation near the Rhine, in a small German town called Reichswald. James had volunteered immediately. How could he not? His company had fought through Normandy, through the hedgerows of Brittany, through every nightmare the continent could throw at them. They were hardened, they were strong, they were ready, and James Whitmore, captain of the 5th Company, would lead them to victory. That had been the promise. Now, standing in the November cold, James knew the truth. The intelligence had been wrong. The Germans had not retreated. They had regrouped, reinforced, and prepared. When the 1st Battalion moved on Reichswald 3 weeks ago, they had walked into a trap. Of the 340 men who left the assembly point that morning, only 112 had returned. The rest had been scattered across that frozen ground like autumn leaves. James had watched them fall. He had called out orders. He had tried to organize a retreat. He had held dying men in his arms and told them they would be all right, that they would see home again. He had lied. And now, standing in this observation post on this gray November morning, James Whitmore understood something terrible and absolute. He would fall in silence, just as his men had fallen. Not by enemy fire, but by the weight of unkeepable promises. The weight of command. The weight of being human in an inhuman place. Lieutenant Davies waited for orders that would never come. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant thunder. Or perhaps it was artillery. After all this time, James could no longer tell the difference between the two. To understand why Captain James Whitmore would fall in silence, one must first understand who he was before the war came and stripped him bare. He was born in 1912 in Manchester, the son of a textile mill manager and a school teacher. His childhood was ordinary, unremarkably so. He played cricket in the summer, collected coins, read adventure novels by candlelight in his bedroom. He was not destined for greatness. No one saw in young James anything that suggested he would one day command men in war. But then came 1939, and everything changed. James enlisted in September, barely a week after Britain declared war on Germany. He was 27 years old, recently married to Margaret Ashworth, the daughter of a local doctor. They had married in April that year, in a small church in Stockport. He had not planned to leave her so soon. He had planned on years of normalcy, perhaps children, a quiet life climbing the ladder of some respectable profession. The army, however, had other plans for James Whitmore. His natural intelligence and steady temperament caught the attention of his commanding officers. By 1940, he had been promoted to sergeant. By 1942, he held the rank of lieutenant. And in 1943, after the North African campaigns, he had been promoted to captain at the age of 31. His service record was spotless. His men respected him. His superiors praised his tactical thinking. Everything seemed to be moving forward. Everything seemed to make sense. James had written to Margaret every week for 5 years. His letters had become the lifeline that kept him human during the dehumanizing machinery of war. He would describe the Scottish Highlands where he trained new recruits, the North African desert where he first saw men die, the anticipation and terror of waiting for the Normandy invasion. But always, he wrote about coming home. He wrote about the future. He spoke of victory as if it were a thing already achieved, a conclusion already drawn. Margaret had kept every letter. She had organized them chronologically on the shelf in their modest home in Manchester. She would read them on nights when the RAF dropped bombs on the city and she sheltered in the basement with little Elizabeth, listening to the thunder of explosions above. James's words were her armor against despair. In his letters, James had painted himself as invincible. He had written about his men as though they were unbreakable. He had described military strategy with confidence, as though victory was inevitable for any man of honor and courage. He had never written about doubt. He had never written about fear. He had never written about the screaming that echoed in his mind when he tried to sleep. The letters had been carefully constructed fiction, a story James told himself and his wife about a world that made sense, where good men won and evil was defeated, where promises meant something, where the future could be counted on to arrive. But the truth, the terrible truth that James had discovered over 5 years of continuous warfare, was that war rewarded neither virtue nor courage. War was indifferent. War was chaos dressed up in strategic plans. War was a machine that consumed men and did not care whether they were good fathers or faithful husbands or decent human beings. By 1944, after the Normandy invasion and the subsequent campaigns across France, James had led his company through combat operations in 7 different sectors of the European theater. He had seen men blown apart by shells. He had watched his best sergeant bleed out from wounds no man could survive. He had ordered men to charge through machine gun fire. He had called strikes on German positions, knowing some of his own soldiers might be caught in the crossfire. And always, he had promised victory. The promise had become his religion, his method of maintaining sanity in an insane world. As long as he believed that it would end in victory, that all this death and suffering would purchase something meaningful, he could continue. He could give orders. He could sleep at night. He could write letters home about a future that would somehow justify the present. But on November 15, 1944, standing in an observation post in Yorkshire, the promise had finally shattered. The week after the Reichswald disaster, James was summoned to divisional headquarters. The commander, Major General Edward Harrison, sat behind a mahogany desk that seemed absurdly ordinary for a place where men's fates were decided. The general had a file open, James's file. The general's expression was unreadable. "Your report on the Reichswald operation is thorough, Captain," General Harrison said, not looking up. "You take full responsibility for the tactical decisions." "Yes, sir." "I do," James replied. His voice sounded strange, distant, as though someone else was speaking through his mouth. 147 men lost. "That's a significant casualty rate." The general finally looked up. His eyes were tired, but it's not outside the parameters of what we've seen elsewhere. Casualties in this war are substantial. James felt something crack inside his chest. Substantial. The word hung in the air like poison gas. These were men. They were not substantial casualties. They were Thompson, who had been married for 2 weeks before shipping out. They were Hughes, a Welsh miner who could sing opera. They were Peterson and Grant and Mullins and 40 others whose names and faces James knew the way he knew his own reflection. "The intelligence was flawed," General Harrison continued. "We've established that German reinforcements reached Reichswald 3 days before your operation. Command-level failure, not yours, Captain. You did what you were ordered to do. You led your men as well as any officer could have under the circumstances. As well as any officer could have." The words offered no comfort. They offered no redemption. In the following weeks, as James returned to his command post in Yorkshire, he noticed something beginning to break inside himself. It started as a small thing. He would find himself staring at the wall for hours without moving. He would read the same sentence in a report 10 times without comprehending it. At night, he would wake up screaming, dreaming of men drowning in mud, calling for him, asking why he had sent them into that trap. His adjutant, Sergeant Matthews, began to express concern. "You should see the medical officer, sir. Get some rest." But James knew that rest would not cure what was wrong with him. Rest could not resurrect the dead. Rest could not remake promises into truth. The war had taught him that some wounds have no medical treatment because they are not physical wounds. They are the wounds that come from knowing you sent men to die, and that no medal or commendation could ever balance that scales. His men noticed the change. They had once looked to him with something approaching reverence. Now they looked at him with a kind of pity. The officer who had promised victory was becoming a ghost, visible but present in name only. James could see it in their eyes, the question mark that had replaced their faith. One evening, late in October, a young private named Coleman approached him. Coleman had been at Reichswald. His arm was still in a sling from shrapnel wounds. "Captain, sir," Coleman said quietly. "We were wondering. I mean, the men? We wanted to know. Do you think we'll have to go back in?" James looked at this boy. He could not have been more than 22, and could not find an answer. In the old days, before Reichswald, he would have offered some version of the promise. He would have said something about duty and victory and the righteousness of their cause. He would have constructed a narrative that made sense of the senseless. But standing before Coleman, James Whitmore found that the words would not come. The lies, which had once been so easy, now stuck in his throat like broken glass. "I don't know, Coleman," he finally said. And it was the most honest thing he had said to any of his men in years. The young private's face fell. He had come seeking reassurance and found only uncertainty. That night, James took out Margaret's letters and read them again. He thought about Elizabeth's birthday. He thought about the bicycle he had promised. He thought about Christmas, which was now only 8 weeks away. He wondered if he would ever see his daughter ride that bicycle. He wondered if promises once broken could ever be repaired. On December 1st, 1944, new orders arrived. The strategic situation in Europe had shifted again. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes was still several weeks away, but High Command was preparing for it. They wanted to consolidate positions along a line running through Belgium and northern France. More operations were planned. More operations meant more men would die. The orders came directly from General Harrison. Captain Whitmore's company, along with 2 others, would be moved to a forward position near Aachen. They would conduct reconnaissance operations in the sector and prepare for potential engagement with German forces. The operation was designated codename Avalanche. It would begin on December 15th. James read the orders 3 times. Each time, the words seemed to rearrange themselves into different meanings, all of them terrible. He was being asked to lead his men into the field again. He was being asked to send them toward possible death. He was being asked to make the promise again, the promise that they would survive, that their sacrifice would mean something, that victory would justify the terrible cost. He could not do it. The realization struck him with the force of physical impact. He could not stand before his men and tell them everything would be all right. He could not look into their eyes and make promises he knew he could not keep. Something in him had broken at Reichswald, and it would not mend. That evening, James sat at his desk and began to write. The letter took 3 hours. He wrote about Reichswald. He wrote about the men who had died there. He wrote about the casualties that were coming, because they were coming. He was certain of it now. He wrote about promises and their worthlessness in the face of war's indifference. He wrote about his doubts, his fears, his certainty that he was not fit to command. When he finished, he read the letter once. Then he put it in an envelope, addressed it to General Harrison, and sealed it. The next morning, he requested a meeting with the general. Harrison received him in his office, and James placed the envelope on the desk. "My resignation, sir." Effective immediately, Harrison opened the envelope and began to read. His expression remained neutral as his eyes moved across the page. When he finished, he looked up at James with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "You want to step down as captain? Step away from command?" "Yes, sir. May I ask why? Your record is exemplary." "Yes, there was Reichswald, but as I said, that was not—" "It's not about Reichswald specifically, sir," James interrupted, which was a violation of protocol. But he no longer cared about protocol. "It's about what command is, what it requires, what it costs. I've realized, General, that I'm not strong enough. I can't make the promises that officers must make. I can't send men to die with confidence that it serves some greater purpose, because I don't believe in that purpose anymore. If I continue, I'll be lying to my men, and they've been lied to enough." General Harrison set the letter down and removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes, looking suddenly very old. Captain Whitmore, do you know how many officers have come to me over the past 5 years with similar sentiments? How many have sat in that chair and told me they couldn't continue? Do you know what I tell them? James remained silent. I tell them that this is the nature of command. That every man in a position of authority must sometimes make decisions that break something inside him. That the war doesn't care about our feelings or our doubts. That if every officer who felt this way stepped down, we would have no army left. Then perhaps we would be better served by having no army, James said quietly. Harrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the resignation letter and tore it in half. Request denied, Captain. You are relieved from active field duties effective immediately. You will return to headquarters and serve as liaison officer. You will not command men in combat, but you will not resign. This war is far from over, and we need officers with your experience, your conscience, and yes, your doubts. We need men who understand the weight of what they're asking their soldiers to do. James left that office carrying the weight of command still, but transformed, redirected into new channels, new forms of anguish. Christmas 1944 came to Manchester on a gray, cold day that felt like any other day of the war. Elizabeth turned 12 on December 22nd. She received the bicycle Captain James Whitmore had promised. It arrived on a military transport truck, delivered by a young courier who didn't know what story was attached to this particular gift. Margaret watched her daughter ride it around the garden, and she wept, though she tried to hide her tears from her child. James was stationed in Brussels by Christmas. He had been moved to a liaison post where he spent his days translating strategic documents and attending briefings. It was meaningful work in its way, but it was not the work of a soldier. It was the work of a man who had been put somewhere safe, somewhere he could no longer break men's lives with bad orders. On Christmas Eve, James received a letter from Margaret. She had received his letter explaining his new posting, and she had understood, though he had been deliberately vague about the reasons for the transfer. She wrote about Elizabeth's bicycle. She wrote about the joy in their daughter's eyes. She wrote about waiting, about hope, about believing that he would come home. And then she wrote, James, whatever has happened to you in this war, whatever you have seen or done, I want you to know that you are not what the war has made you. You are still the man I married. You are still Elizabeth's father. Come home to us, please. Just come home. James read this letter in his small Brussels apartment, and something inside him, some last fragile thing, broke completely. He did not cry. He had stopped crying sometime in 1943. Instead, he sat motionless for hours, the letter resting on the desk before him. The war would continue for 5 more months. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Captain James Whitmore was among those who had survived. He had kept his life while so many others had not. It seemed like an injustice, though he could not articulate why. He returned to Manchester in August 1945. He wore his uniform to the railway station, though he no longer felt like a soldier. Elizabeth, now 13, stood beside Margaret on the platform. She had grown taller. She looked at him as though she was trying to remember who this man was, this stranger in uniform carrying a single canvas bag. James embraced his wife and held his daughter, and he felt absolutely nothing. The capacity for feeling seemed to have been burned out of him somewhere on a frozen field near Reichswald. He had promised victory, and victory had come. Hitler was dead. Germany was defeated. Democracy had triumphed. But in the darkness of night, in the quiet of his small home, James Whitmore heard only silence. The silence of the men who had not come home. The silence of promises kept only by accident. The silence of a man who understood that victory, when it finally arrived, was empty, just as hollow as defeat, just as meaningless, just as unable to restore what had been lost. He worked for the local government after the war. He and Margaret had another child, a son born in 1947. He attended church every Sunday and struggled to believe in God. He volunteered with veterans organizations and listened to other men's stories without sharing his own. He became a man of few words, a man of profound silences. In 1952, he suffered a severe heart attack. He survived, but something had fundamentally shifted. The doctor said his heart was damaged. James understood that it was not his physical heart that was broken, but something deeper, some essential capacity for hope or trust or connection. Margaret cared for him through his recovery. Elizabeth, now grown into a young woman, visited often and tried to know her father. But James remained distant, kind but unreachable, a man who had fallen into silence and could not find his way back to language. He lived for another 23 years. He died quietly in his sleep in 1975, and Margaret found him the next morning. At his funeral, men in uniform stood at attention and saluted. They called him a hero. They spoke about his service and his sacrifice, but none of them understood that Captain James Whitmore had fallen in silence long before his death. Fallen on that frozen field near Reichswald, where he had learned that promises made in wartime could never be kept. And that victory, when it came, could not resurrect the dead or absolve the living. His grave in Southern Cemetery reads simply, Captain James Edmund Whitmore, 1912-1975, beloved husband and father. There is no mention of war, no medals engraved in stone, just a name, dates marking the span of a life, and the word beloved, which was perhaps the only promise he managed to keep. And in that silence, in that ordinary grave lies the true legacy of war. Not glory or victory, but the profound, aching silence of men who saw too much, promised too much, and survived long enough to regret it all. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the real cost of war and the men who fought it, we ask you to comment below. Share your thoughts, share your family's stories of war, and please subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity, that connect us across generations and across oceans. These stories matter. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be heard.